Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Nicola Tallis, historian and author of a new book called Young Elizabeth, which is a biographical book about Queen Elizabeth I, looking at her childhood and adolescence. We spoke about the various challenges faced by Tudor women, not just Elizabeth, but also her mother, Anne Boleyn, her sister Mary Tudor, the complications of marriage, of sex, of religion, the contradictions sometimes involved in being a royal woman at this period. In the extended episode, we spoke about events after the death of Henry VIII and went almost up to Elizabeth's coronation. I think we got to Mary's coronation, a lot of events to pack in. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find, as always, the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and also the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Probably everyone listening is going to be pretty much aware of the Henry VIII and his 6 wives kind of sequence, right?
Yes,
sequence of events. That's the really famous bit. The thing that I realised I hadn't really thought about, though, when I was reading your book, even though I am very familiar with that history, is the impact that it had on Elizabeth. So she was 2.5 when her mother was killed. What do we know about how much contact she would have had with her mother in those 2.5 years? You had this interesting reference to Anne maybe having wanted to breastfeed her daughter, and that being an outrageous and scandalous thing for a queen to suggest. How much would she have actually seen her? I mean, what does a Tudor baby childhood look like for a royal?
It's a really good question, and the truth is that we only have very scattered references as to the frequency with which Elizabeth would have seen her mother, and these suggest that she saw her once every few months, perhaps, when Anne visited Elizabeth at her childhood home of Hatfield, or when Elizabeth visited court with her household to visit her parents there.
So they're living in different palaces.
That's right. They're very much living in different palaces, which is very usual by royal standards. And in Elizabeth's case, it's usual because she is the king's heir at the time of her birth. And so her life is very precious. And London, which is, of course, the centre of royal court life, is a haven for pestilence and disease, particularly in the summer. And so it would have been considered of the utmost importance that Elizabeth was removed from this, which is why her household is established at Hatfield, 20 miles north of London, when she's just 3 months old. So that's something very usual.
So all of these palaces like Eltham and Richmond and Hatfield, they've now been absorbed into London sprawl, but at the time these were rural palaces.
Exactly that, yes. They are considered to be rural palaces, and so that's considered to be the ideal place to raise a royal child because it's far enough from London to provide, hopefully, immunity from things like the plague, but also close enough to provide easy access for the court and for messengers to and from the court as well.
So Elizabeth has a wet nurse. She has an army of staff, from the sounds of things.
Yes. So, yes, so she is, it's quite extraordinary, really, isn't it, when you think about it and think this is a tiny baby, yes, a royal one, but There are no roles left unconsidered. I mean, the fact that there are 4 people employed probably to rock her cradle in shifts, I think is quite astonishing and extraordinary. And it just goes to show really the level of protocol and, you know, the level of attention to detail that is granted to the upbringing and the comfort of this royal child as well. But, you know, these people who surround Elizabeth in her early life are an extension of her family, really, and they're hugely, hugely important to her. And it's obvious that many of these people care and love her very deeply as well.
What is the class background generally of someone who'd be employed in that kind of servant role, who's basically forming the crucial intimate relationships with the royal baby?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Usually you are looking at someone who is gentry level at least. And we see this, for example, with Blanche Parry, who is one of Elizabeth's rockers, later becomes one of Elizabeth's ladies when she's queen. And she comes from sort of a relatively humble background, you know, minor gentry in Herefordshire, but she gets her golden ticket, if you like, into Elizabeth's household through a relative of hers, Lady Troy, who's probably a member of Anne Boleyn's household as well, but certainly has connections there. So again, it's all about who you know, really, and those networks and those connections are of the utmost importance.
And it means, therefore, that when we think, I mean, I'm sure that the execution of her mother was a source of great, well, she wouldn't probably have known anything about it at the time because she was too little, but would have become a great source of distress and fear and horror for her. But she didn't have a relationship with her mother that we would expect from a sort of contemporary relationship with one's mother.
No, exactly that. Her mother, Elizabeth, would have been raised for the first 2.5 years of her life knowing that this is her mother and this is the queen. And, you know, I think there is also obviously evidence that Anne took a very close interest in her daughter in a material sense as well. So it's very much Anne who's responsible for providing Elizabeth with clothes and with all of the trappings of royalty that one might expect. But yes, absolutely. I think on an emotional level, it's difficult to say, but probably not the sort of relationship that one might necessarily expect from a contemporary queen and princess relationship.
Or there's these trappings, right? Or the clothes and the whatever, the reams of fabric, all of this, a crucial source of conflict between the young Mary and Elizabeth, right? So Mary is the older sister who has been displaced.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's so terribly sad because Mary, as you say, yes, she is the older sister. She is the sole surviving product of Henry's marriage with Catherine of Aragon. And this really automatically puts her at loggerheads with Anne Boleyn and thus with Elizabeth through no fault of either Mary or Elizabeth. But yes, Mary is, as a result of Elizabeth's birth, denied her title of princess and sent to live in Elizabeth's household. And all of her jewels are taken from her status is taken from her, and she is effectively forced to yield precedence to this baby, and this baby whose mother, Anne Boleyn, she absolutely loathes. And it's a really terrible situation, actually, for both of these youngsters. And I've got so much sympathy for Mary at this time. I think it's very, very difficult for her to transition in terms of this change in status from royal princess to a disinherited daughter. It's really hard on an emotional and a physical level for her.
And all of these physical displays of status, like jewellery and clothing and palace rooms and so on, Mary's acutely aware of this, right? So you write at one point, for instance, about her taking the opportunity, because there's some delay when they're travelling to court, to ride ahead so that she arrives at court before Elizabeth does, as a sort of one-upping the the young rival.
Yeah, exactly that. Mary takes any opportunity basically to push herself forward ahead of Elizabeth, because although she does accept Elizabeth to be her sister, she doesn't accept that Elizabeth is a princess above her. That's something that she really, really struggles with. And yeah, any opportunity, I suppose in some ways it's quite petulant, but who can blame her in the circumstances, just taking any chance she can get to score those points and to show. I think it's a show of defiance, basically, and her saying, yeah, absolutely, I'm not prepared to accept that Elizabeth is better than me. And I think that it's something that doesn't go down very well with Anne Boleyn at all. But Henry VIII, more crucially, from Mary's perspective, it doesn't do anything to warm Mary in her father's eyes either. So, but I think, as I say, Mary's very much on her own from an emotional and a physical perspective, really. She's got nobody to turn to and nobody really fighting her corner at this time. So I think those displays of behaviour are perfectly understandable.
Yeah, it is really easy to read some of that behaviour as petulant, and indeed some of Henry VIII's behaviour in relation to his wives as the behaviour of sort of a paranoid and horny old man, right?
Yeah.
And that is one way of reading it, right? But then I guess the thing that's easy to forget, maybe as a modern reader, is how dangerous all of this was, how many people end up losing their heads in these dynastic disputes, the risk of civil war, the fact that to be fair to Henry VIII, right, the fact that having a clear heir was very important. So his obsession with doing that wasn't just a vanity thing or whatever. It was actually it was a focus of obsession for him because of the risk of conflict if he didn't succeed.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, we have to remember at this time that there isn't any precedent really for female rule in England. The only example we have comes from much earlier with the Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, and that doesn't go at all well. And so Henry does genuinely believe that a woman isn't capable of ruling, and hence the desperation for this male heir to succeed him. So yeah, absolutely, as you say, it is far more than a vanity thing. It is a genuine belief and a genuine concern on Henry's part as to what will happen to his kingdom if there isn't this son to succeed him.
So when Mary and Elizabeth are young, is there really any prospect? They both end up being queen, right? Spoiler alert. But is there any real thought that might happen, or is this kind of status squabbling? Is it arguably more petulant than not, because it's not actually focused on who's going to be queen? It's focused on who's the favoured daughter. Or I mean, given that there is basically no precedent for a female monarch, what do people think about this at the time?
I think, to be honest, it's not necessarily about who might be queen, because at the time that Anne Boleyn dies and Elizabeth is declared illegitimate as well, she's only 2.5 years old at this time. So she would never really have had any real understanding of the fact that at one point she was her father's heir and she was the one who, however temporarily, was next in line to the throne. So I think that a lot of this is done out of petulance, really, yes, on Mary's part. But I think that as soon as Anne Boleyn is out of the way and Jane Seymour becomes queen, and of course she gives birth to Edward, then it becomes clear that both of these girls are immediately after Anne Boleyn's execution, actually, it becomes clear that both of these girls are very much in the same boat in terms of status. They're both the king's daughters, but they both are illegitimate. And when Prince Edward is born to Jane Seymour in October 1537, I think then all thoughts really are focused on their status as Henry's daughters. And it's very much he who decides what their future holds. So I think it's only the first real couple years of Elizabeth's life when this power struggle for precedence going on between the sisters, more on Mary's side, and that definitely changes and settles down a bit later.
When Anne is executed, is Henry's illegitimate son still alive, or has he died by then?
He's just about alive, but he dies a couple of months later.
Okay. So there is a period where the two illegitimate daughters definitely have no claim to the throne because there is an illegitimate son available.
Yes,
right,
exactly. Henry Fitzroy is there too, yes.
Yes, but then once he dies, he's replaced by Edward, and then it sort of seems to be settled. And does Elizabeth lose a great deal of status? She's obviously a toddler, so she has no idea what's going on. But in terms of her physical signifiers of status, is that lost when her mother dies?
Technically, I mean, it's difficult to say, but certainly it seems that she has been forgotten. I think it has been suggested that she has been neglected by her father at that point onwards, but I would argue that that's probably too strong a term. I think we have enough contemporary evidence to show that Henry did really love his daughter and have a great deal of affection for Elizabeth. I think in the aftermath of Anne's execution, when Henry is busy marrying Jane Seymour, that only happens 11 days after Anne's execution, and very much in the honeymoon period with Jane, I think Elizabeth's needs are temporarily forgotten, in so much that her governess is writing to the king's advisor, Thomas Cromwell, to say Elizabeth has outgrown all of her clothes, things that had very much been taken care of and prioritised during the lifetime of her mother. Those sorts of things are now seemingly no longer a priority. So I wouldn't say necessarily that she would have noticed a great deal in terms of the physicalities of her status, in terms of changes there. I think that perhaps there's this period of adaptation when it's not quite clear who is responsible for Elizabeth's care and ordering clothes, for example. But we do see Jane Seymour ordering clothes for Elizabeth. So I think that anything stronger than temporarily forgotten is perhaps, not necessarily indicative of the truth.
But her status is sort of equalised with Mary.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. It's very much equalised, yeah.
What do we know about how Elizabeth found out about her mother's fall, and also what she came to think about it? Because it obviously happened when she was far too young. But what evidence do we have for how she felt about it in later years?
It's such a good question, and one that we don't fully know the answer to, in so much that we don't know how and when Elizabeth found out the truth about her mother. We do know that she was at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire at the time of Anne's execution, and that so too was Mary, and that Lady Kingston, who had been with Anne in her final days at the Tower, she's the wife of the constable of the Tower, that Lady Kingston is sent to Hunsdon to tell Mary about Anne's execution. There's no evidence that Elizabeth was told at that time, and I'd suggest that she probably wasn't told at that time. So we don't know how that comes about, but we do know that there are signs that Elizabeth resonated with her mother and did her best to try and remember her later in her life. And we see this so much as the relationships that Elizabeth shared with members of her mother's family, for example. So particularly Henry and Catherine Carey, who were the children of Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary Boleyn. We know that Elizabeth has very, very strong and close relationships with those two children, and that those definitely start at some point in her youth and are maintained for the rest of her life. And certainly, I mean, there's a reference, for example, to a member of the Boleyn family in Elizabeth's accounts when she's about 16, 17 years old as well. So it is clear that there's some kind of contact there. And There is also the suggestion that her mother's likeness is contained in a ring, the famous checkers ring, which contains a miniature of Elizabeth and one of another woman who, it is argued, and I would probably agree with this, is Anne Boleyn, and that this was a sign that Elizabeth was keen to keep her mother close to her and eager to remember her. So I think that there are signs that Elizabeth was very interested in her mother and was keen to remember her in her own way, but quite how far this went, she never spoke about her openly as such. And again, it's been argued that Elizabeth never had her mother's remains moved from the Tower and reburied elsewhere in Westminster Abbey, for example. I would say actually that's quite a political move on Elizabeth's part, and she judged that it was probably best to let sleeping dogs lie. I don't think we can actually infer anything about the relationship from that. So to all intents and purposes, I think there's definitely signs that she felt sympathetic towards her mother.
It's this interesting tension in this history, isn't it? Because there's so much personal drama and tragedy and evil behaviour in this history. It's so tempting to read it purely as psychodrama and to forget the politics. As you mentioned, her decision as to where her mother's remains are interned is not just a personal question, it's a highly political question. And you obviously have written 5 books now about the Tudors. I share the same interest in the Tudors that practically everyone does, I think. I suspect that part of the reason the Tudors are so fascinating is because of all this psychodrama stuff, because of all the I was going to ask about Elizabeth's physical similarity with Anne Boleyn, because what Anne Boleyn looked like is this endless source of fascination for fans of Tudor history, because she was clearly incredibly sexy. She can't not have been. But we don't exactly know, there are different accounts, right? Talk to me about this, because this question of what she looked like is so fascinating. Was she good looking?
Yeah, most sources suggest that she wasn't good looking by contemporary standards, in terms of the fact that contemporaries admired very pale skin, whereas Anne was considered to be swarthy and olive skinned, that she had various moles which weren't considered to be particularly attractive as well. But she did have very dark and piercing eyes, and she did exude this sex appeal and this charm and this charisma. And I think that it is that made her really attractive and beautiful to her admirers and to Henry in particular, because yes, all other sources seem to agree that while she was striking in looks, certainly she's not considered to be beautiful as such. And, Anne's enemies as well talk about the fact that, obviously they've got a bias and opinion, but talk about the fact that, she's got a large mouth, and, talk about her breasts and all these sorts of things. And I think that they've most clearly got an agenda. But yes, there is most definitely something about Anne, and it's definitely that sense of real charm, and also I think confidence in herself, the huge self-confidence that she exudes, and the style and sophistication. That's something that's seen as hugely attractive and extremely sexy to Henry VIII.
And Elizabeth was fair-skinned, though, wasn't she? And she had the Tudor red hair. So in that sense, she didn't look like her mother?
No, that's right. So she did very typically have many Tudor characteristics, including, as you say, the red hair, also the famous temper. But she did have her mother's eyes, most contemporaries agree. And, she also has, if you look at the portraits, although we don't really have anything, or not very much, that's contemporary for Anne, but certainly they appear to have had a similar shaped face. And there were, again, characteristics that Elizabeth was believed to have in common with her mother. And it's something that later on her sister Mary comments on, the fact that Elizabeth is thought to have characteristics that resemble her mother, and she doesn't mean it in a complimentary sense.
I wonder, as I was thinking again about this question of why the Tudors are so interesting. Did you go to the exhibition of Holbein drawings that was at the Queen's Gallery earlier this year?
I did, yes, I certainly did.
And I love the Holbein drawing. I find the drawings are more immediate than the paintings. They feel more real, and I wonder to what extent actually Holbein is partly responsible for people being so fascinated with this history, because the immediacy of those depictions is startling, and there's nothing like that in, say, medieval portraiture. It's a completely fresh way of depicting people.
You're absolutely right. I think Holbein really changed the face of 16th century portraiture at the Tudor court, and in many respects, England were very much behind the curve compared to the rest of Europe in terms of portraiture. And so Holbein really revolutionized the way that contemporaries saw people, and in turn, the way that we see people. So absolutely, I think suddenly people who had previously appeared as flat and two-dimensional, they do just stare at you in a really lifelike way from the page. And as you say, those drawings, they are actually so much more effective in terms of conveying these people as real people than the paintings are. Just the attention to detail is absolutely startling. So I think that with his skills, for the first time, we do actually see these people as real people who lived 500 years ago.
Leaning into the psychodrama stuff. I don't want to. I don't want to succumb, but it's also so tempting. And I know that we're just forced to speculate, but thinking about Elizabeth's famous decision never to marry, to what extent do you think that was informed by her childhood experiences, and in particular what happened to her mother?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I think we know that she made her first known recorded reference of her desire to remain single and not marry during the reign of her half-brother, Edward VI. So that decision, the fact that that decision has been made so early in her life, shows us that Elizabeth has been exposed to things and seen things that have influenced her and led her to reach that decision. And without doubt, her mother's fall plays a huge part in that. You know, she has heard the way in which, or we can assume that she's heard of the way in which her father has treated and discarded her mother. But I think also she probably would have also been affected by the way in which her father had treated Catherine of Aragon. She would have come to hear about that as well. And then she also has first-hand experience in terms of she has some kind of relationship with the remaining 4 of Henry's wives, arguably not a very close relationship with most of them, but she would have learnt of the fact that the first of her stepmothers, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth, and then that her father discarded Anne of Cleves. You know, she's 8 years old at the time that Catherine Howard is executed. And I think that none of these examples would have been lost on Elizabeth. She's seen how easily her father has discarded these women and the terrible way in which these marriages have ended. And it's bound to have had an impact on her, a very deep psychological impact on her, I would suggest. And yes, it's frustrating because we don't know for sure. She never left us any written clues as to her exact feelings. But I think most definitely that behaviour later on in life is shaped and dictated by what she's seen and experienced in her youth. It can't not have been.
Thinking about it also in a political sense, what are the, I know that Mary also wavers about whether to marry, although of course she does. What are the advantages and disadvantages of marriage for a woman in that position? Because it's a slightly odd position where you are, even as not heir, even as just princess, you know, extraordinarily high status, wealthy, important woman. But of course, the expectation is still, I suppose, submission to the husband. So how does that interact with the political question of marriage?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting, and I think that this actually works to Elizabeth's advantage in so much that she is the younger of the two sisters, and so she is able to watch and learn from what Mary's been through when it comes to making her own decisions. Because with Mary, as you say, she did deliberate over whether to marry, but really I think she knew that there was no real choice. She knew that the expectation was on a woman to marry. There wasn't really an option for her to say no, because it was what was expected. It was believed that a woman wasn't capable of ruling by herself or governing successfully by herself. And so it just was very much the expectation. And there had been talks, it's important to say, of both marriage for Elizabeth and Mary during both the reign of Henry VIII and Edward VI. And had those marriages been had those negotiations gone any further, then both girls would have been fully expected to submit to their fates, either at the hands of their father or their brother. And it is only because of a result of the extraordinary circumstances in which they find themselves, in terms of the fact that Mary actually does become queen in 1553, that it does seem that there is some kind of choice. But I would say there's only a choice in so much as the fact that Mary gets to choose who that husband might be, not whether there is going to be a husband at all. And as you say, it is expected that a woman will be subservient to her husband, but there is a lot of deliberation about this in Mary's case, in terms of, well, how does that work if that woman and the wife is a queen, and how does it work? So it's very clear that Philip is, when Mary settles on marrying Philip of Spain, her second cousin, it's very clear that he is expected to come to England as her consort, but not to exert any authority or rule on her behalf. But I think Mary finds that very, very difficult on a personal level and a political level, because she really struggles with that sense of knowing that her duty is to be obedient to her husband, but at the same time, she is a queen regnant in her own right. And she is put under a great deal of pressure by Philip, particularly in terms of on the political front, when he wants England to lend its support to his wars abroad. And eventually, Mary capitulates to that, and because she sees it as her wifely duty. So it's a very, very difficult balance to try and make that work. And I think that this is something that, as I say, Elizabeth really benefits from watching Mary before her, and sees where Mary goes wrong.
Yes, and concluding that this marriage business is maybe not a very good idea. There's a lot of English disquiet and resistance to Philip as a match for Mary, right? Do you think there would have been that level of disquiet if the sexes had been reversed, if this were a king or a king-to-be intending to marry a foreign royal woman?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think with Mary, I mean, whoever she married, I think there would have been problems, because the other candidate who's put forward from the beginning is Edward Courtenay, who is an English candidate, and one who's got a claim to the throne in his own right through the House of York and his blood ties and connections there. But I think that you can see when you read the correspondence that's taking place at this time that nobody can agree on who a suitable candidate might be. And I think that this very much, we see this translate into Mary's own mind with her indecision and the turmoil that she faces in her mind as to whether to marry or not. And I don't think that you would ever have seen that sort of tension and that sort of deliberation if there were a king on the throne. When Edward VI, there are talks of him marrying a French princess, there's none of this sort of deliberation or worry going on. There are candidates suggested for his hand, but it's just not the same. It is all on account of Mary's gender, and the fact that picking a husband is considered to be of the utmost importance in terms of his identity. And yeah, unfortunately for her, it is something she gets wrong.
I'm skipping forward a little bit in the biography, but I'll come back in a second because I want to talk about religion in a moment. But just staying with this marriage thing, do you think that if Elizabeth had married, her reign wouldn't have been as long and successful as it was? Do you think that to some extent she needed to remain unmarried in order to succeed as monarch?
I think that she thought that she needed to stay single in order to succeed as monarch. I think that there were, again, because when Elizabeth becomes queen, there are so many different candidates suggested as potential husbands for her, and nobody can quite agree on who the right husband might be for her. And I think, to be perfectly honest, she was very worried about having her authority superseded by that of a husband. And I think she did a very good job of playing the game in terms of appearing to consider potential husbands over the years. But really, I think, yes, she was very worried about her own power and position being eroded, and felt that men in general were very unreliable, actually. And she's seen this previously with her father and Thomas Seymour as well. So I think that she really at this time felt that her only chance of security lay in herself. And if she only had to rely on herself, then she couldn't go far wrong. So I think it all actually comes out of a sense of insecurity on Elizabeth's part and feeling like she could only rely on her own judgment and trust herself.
And probably merited based on the context. Going back to her childhood and Mary's, religious conflict, which is going to become very important during their reigns. How does their upbringing differ in terms of their religious schooling? So Mary is obviously just raised Catholic because, well, they wouldn't even have called it Catholic, right? Because this is all pre-Reformation. Elizabeth isn't. I mean, what is Elizabeth taught in terms of her attitude towards the church?
Yeah, so Elizabeth is raised as a Protestant in terms of the fact that she's raised with people who, raised by people who have got slightly different, slightly less conservative religious views. So there is more of an emphasis on being able to interpret religious texts and read them oneself rather than on a reliance of priests to do that for you.
But people are not. The people are not yet reading the Bible in English, or are on the cusp of reading the Bible in English at that point.
Yes. So Elizabeth is raised more as a Protestant, and as indeed is her half brother Edward as well. So they're both raised in a very similar way. We don't know exactly what this would have looked like, really, in terms of their early education and their early shaping. And in fact, where religion's concerned, Elizabeth is far more subtle than either of her siblings, which is quite interesting, and I think is quite reflective, actually, of her shrewdness of character. Both Mary and Edward are very, very fervent in their faiths, and this is something that ultimately drives them apart, whereas Elizabeth is always quite keen to maintain a middle road, if you like, and keep the peace. And indeed, in Mary's reign, when she finds herself in danger, there is mention made of her converting to Catholicism, which she does appear to do. But this is something that seems to have been done for outward appearances only, and with an eye to keeping herself safe. It's quite clear that actually she hasn't been raised with the same adherence to Catholicism as Mary has. And this is why she asks Mary for instruction in the principles of Catholicism and how this all works, in order to see if she can find that belief. And ultimately, she decides that she can't. But it is something that is raised several times through Mary's reign, is the fact that Elizabeth, on several occasions, appears willing to conform to Catholicism. But it's obvious that it isn't something that she truly believes in.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.